Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History podcast. I'm joined by Dr. Joanna Kujawa, and today we're going to be discussing Jung's individualization and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And I also want to refer real quick to The Other Goddess. I'll have a link to purchase the book in the description below. This is Joanna Kujawa's book, The Other Goddess, Mary Magdalene, and the Goddess of Eros and Secret Knowledge. And when we get toward the end, we're going to discuss a little bit about her course as well, but we'll get to that at the end. With that being said, thank you for joining me once again, Joanna. It's been a bit.
Hi, Jacob. Good to see you again and good to be back.
Thank you for joining me. So first, I want to start off with, what is Jung's view of individualization?
That's a fantastic start, actually, Jacob. So thank you for this. So Carl Jung actually, for the first time, spoke about individuation in 1902 and in his PhD. And I'm just going to read the title of a PhD on the psychology and pathology of a so-called occult phenomena. And it is kind of funny because he says so-called occult phenomena, because later, of course, he was very much interested in occult and Gnosticism, and in the Gnostics, he called them his ancient friends. So he was interested already, but didn't really get into it until his professional breakup with Freud, which happened around 1912, which is about 10 years later. And there he defined individuation in two essays on analytical psychology. So this is the definition that I really love, and I'm going to share with you and your viewers. So what is individuation? Bringing together all our parts, which results in creating and embracing the incompatible uniqueness of our individual self. So this is already very rich. So obviously, psyche, we are, combined of many different parts of ourselves, different aspects of our psyche. So individuation is bringing all of these parts of ourselves, and with the view that it's going to be something very unique, and also understanding that some of these parts are completely incompatible. So usually the incompatible parts are those that we want to reject. And then, and this was his major difference with Sigmund Freud, he says, I believe that it was always of spiritual nature. So individuation was always of spiritual nature. And later in his life, he actually spelled individuation with IN in dash individuation. So also he added that we can equate it with self-realization, which is obviously also a very spiritual influence on him. So basically, I repeat once again, it is bringing all our parts together, understanding that some of them are completely incompatible and we actually don't want them, but they are there. And through this, we actually create a unique being that we needed to be, that we always were. And the process at the end is actually a spiritual process, and it's it's very similar, at least, to the process of what Eastern sages were talking about when we're talking about self-realization. So self-realization in Jung is not what it was in Freud, which means basically bringing just ego together, but it's actually transcending ego, which is a very spiritual concept. And this is really how Jung was different from Freud. Does it make sense?
Yes. Yeah, and I misspoke earlier. When I said individualization, I meant to say individuation. I'm not sure what happened there with me. Anyway, I guess that happens. What is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene? Mm-hmm. For those that don't know what that is. And my second part to that question is, how is it connected to Jung's view of individuation?
Yes. So these are very good questions. So the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is one of the Gnostic Gospels, which this one was discovered in the 19th century. And there actually, at the beginning, there were two separate papyri. One was in Coptic, one was in Greek, in the city of Akhmin. And there is a special special meaning to this that we can explore later. And later, with another city, a few years later, Oxyrhynchus, which are on the other side of the Nile. And there, basically, Mary Magdalene is giving teachings, Jesus conveying actually Jesus' teachings to the other apostles. So this is basically it. And that's a very interesting part, because the Gnostics believe that Mary Magdalene was one of the initiates with which Jesus shared his most advanced teachings, because he gave her basically 3 levels of teachings. One for the fishermen and rural men around the Lake of Galilee, the second one to all of his followers or disciples, and the third one only to his most advanced disciples. And then some Gnostic group believed that Mary Magdalene was one of these advanced disciples. So this is basically, we have only parts of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Some parts are missing in the middle. And yes, it gives us a very different portrayal of Mary Magdalene when what is actually given in a canonical Bible. So she's not a prostitute there. And in my other talks for you, I don't know if you want me to mention it, it's basically a scriptural mistake done by one of the popes, who in one of his homilies, I think it was homily 33, when he basically conflated Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinner in the Bible. So more and more we learn about Mary Magdalene and her teachings. And when I was been doing it, following the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, both also on a scholarly, but also on a personal level, especially after reading a fantastic book by Jean-Yves Leloup, The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which I also highly recommend. And he actually gives a very deep perspective on this. And then through my own reading, which I consider a sacred text personally, I started to add other aspects to this, because often it is forgotten that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was actually found in Egypt. So of course there are also Egyptian influences there, which I discuss in my book and in my coming book. But in this book, in The Other Goddess, I discuss the Egyptian connections between the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the esoteric teachings of Egypt. So this is basically it. So it's one of the Gnostic Gospels. We have only parts of this. This is where Mary Magdalene is teaching other disciples what the teacher said. So in the first part, basically, it's a conversation between the disciples and Jesus. And then, few pages are missing. Obviously, the crucifixion already happened, because then the distraught disciples are coming to Mary Magdalene and say, "Sister, please teach us about the things that the teacher told you, but he didn't share with us." And this is what Mary Magdalene starts to say. She starts to elaborate on the teachings. At the end of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, there is a big dispute, because some disciples say, "Oh, I don't believe that he shared these teachings with this woman. How is it possible that he shared the sacred teachings with her?" And then others are saying, I think it is maybe Levi, if I remember, yes, Levi says, "Please leave her alone, that he loved her more than us." So it is a very controversial, even just for this ending, gospel.
What else does the Gospel of Mary Magdalene say about Mary? Is any of it historically reliable?
Well, so I look at the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and any sacred text in a sense that what actually the teachings are teaching us, right? So we're Christian groups spread around the Mediterranean Sea, and they were interpreting the teachings of Jesus in different ways. And the Gnostics wanted to interpret it there's nothing like Gnostics, but different Gnostic groups try to interpret it in different ways. When it was done by the forming church in Rome, which now merged into a Catholic church. So Mary Magdalene for the Gnostics became a symbol, really, of a different interpretation of the teachings of Jesus, so to speak. In The Other Goddess, I kind of discuss my theory, what is possible that happened to Mary Magdalene, considering that she was not, what it was assumed she was, and in fact nobody considered her to be a prostitute. until the 4th century, and it really settled in the 6th century. So that's interesting in itself. So I did some research, and of course it's just a proposition, because in the 1st century Alexandria, there was a group of philosophers, Jewish philosophers, Jewish Neoplatonists, but also connected to the Egyptian mysteries called Therapete or Therapetai, who were also called the healers, but they meant spiritual healers, and they also, apart from teachings of Jesus, were also connected to the mysteries of Isis. And they welcome educated and spiritually evolved women there. So I had a theory that, because all the disciples dispersed after the crucifixion, that if I were Mary Magdalene, I would be looking for a friendly place, right? So Alexandria would be the friendliest place, and especially that the Therapetai were also very close with the Essenes, and some scholars believe that Jesus was connected to the Essenes as well. So I just theorize. I'm not saying that it happened like that. I theorize that it is quite possible that Mary Magdalene went to Alexandria because she would be welcome there because of the connections with the Essenes, and also because it was very rare in those days that a spiritually advanced woman and a woman philosopher or a learned woman could join a group of philosophers, and Therapetai allowed for this. And the rest is a little bit more anecdotal, because I also checked, was there a woman in Alexandria who may fit the description, and I basically hypothesized that maybe it was Mary the Jewess, or Mary the alchemist, or Mary the prophetess, which was a 1st century Jewish woman living in Alexandria, who was also called the spiritual alchemist. And we know this from Zosimus, who was from Akhmin, actually. He was from Panapolis, which is a modern name for Panapolis is Akhmin, when the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was found. And he said she was, the spiritual alchemist, and she was one of the greatest alchemists ever. So I don't know, every time we talk about great teachers, we can argue whether they were historical figures or not. And I think you have lots of podcasts on this. And I also was on one of them, I think Professor MacDonald, we had a debate about Mary Magdalene, and we had different opinions. And I was, arguing that she did exist, even scripturally. She had, if you look even in canonical scriptures, she's named more times than any other woman in very significant moments of a story, of a narrative about Jesus. So this is a kind of an argument that scholars go on forever. I would like to personally focus on the spiritual teachings of this, because did they existed? I think they all existed, but of course there are different scholarly opinions, and we had another podcast about that. So when I was one of the things that I did with the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, after trying to understand it, because it's an esoteric teaching, so it's not easy. It's not like reading a simple story. There are a lot of encoded messages, which is usually with all esoteric traditions, whether Hindu or Gnostic traditions, it's called the twilight language. So it means it is kind of written so the initiated only understand. So it took me 20 years, of close connection with the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and then looking at it from a perspective of, Egyptian mysteries. And then I started to give talks for Carl Jung societies around Australia, and I started to notice similarities between his process of individuation and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because both of them have 4 stages of, so to speak, of self-realization, so to speak. So the Gospel of Mary Magdalene talks about it, although she uses obviously a different vocabulary, and Carl Jung talks about it as well, right? And I thought that it was really important to do this because it kind of contemporizes the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because people can say, okay, so, what are the teachings and how we can apply them? This is the question I often asked. And then I thought, well, actually, there are many parallels between what Jung parallels, it's not identical, but similarities between 4 stages of individuation that Carl Jung explained in modern times, and some aspects of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which also argues that there are 4 levels of, in modern language, you would say ascension or self-realization. So this is what I focused on, because I thought that it would help people to understand what the gospel was about, that it has some practical application, and that kind of Jung intuitively tuned into this, because Jung called the Gnostics his ancient friends. He had an experience in 1916 with the Gnostics as well, when he claims that, he was with his family in his house in Switzerland, and suddenly the bell rang and everybody heard it in the house, but nobody was at the door. And then this kind of whole bunch, this is what Jung is saying, entities entered his office, and they said, they were looking for some guidance, right? And he signed this work as Basilides, who was a 2nd century Alexandrian Gnostic. Also, interestingly, because of his great interest in the Gnostics, when in 1945 Nag Hammadi was discovered, some of his friends and friendly professors managed to smuggle some of the codices from Nag Hammadi and presented him with some of them on his 80th birthday. And since then, this is called also the Jung Codex. So this is just establishing some connection between Jung and Gnostics. However, to be completely transparent, he could not hear about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene because it was not translated until 1950s for the first time. And it is also known as the Berlin Codex. But he had a huge affinity both with the Gnostics and with the Egyptian mysteries. He also compared, because if I use some kind of some examples from Egyptian mysteries as well, if you want, or we can just focus on the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and Jung, if you prefer. He also believed that the story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene was, in a way, repetition or a parallel version of the story of Osiris and Isis, right? Because he was very interested in this kind of esoterica.
Can you expand more on that? What links did he see specifically between those two?
Yes, so I think between Jung and between the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, do you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
So
Go ahead.
Okay, so between the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and Jung's process of individuation, if you want, then we can go through the stages, of the Gospel, what are the stages of consciousness, of development of human consciousness, because this is what I believe the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is. And, Jung's process of individuation, which he believed it was a spiritual process and that we evolve spiritually as well. So if you want, I can go through the 4 stages and in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and say what is a parallel terminology in Jung and give some examples so it's easier for everybody to understand. And also we can deliver what I said we would deliver, which means it gives people a more practical understanding of both the gospel and the process of individuation. Would you be happy with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, I occasionally may look at the notes, so I'm not misquoting anything, if you don't mind. So first of all, in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the first level, which is the lowest level of human consciousness, because it's discussing levels of human consciousness. And basically it says that depending on which level of consciousness you operate, you see things differently, perceive things differently. So for example, the first one is what most spiritual traditions talk about. This is a wrong identification. What is the wrong identification? It is identification only with the material world. So you think you're just this body, there is no soul, you completely believe only what the science is telling you. Since you cannot touch the soul, it doesn't exist. You cannot take a photograph of the soul, it doesn't exist. So basically it is a very kind of materialistic determinism point of view, right? So it is called wrong identification. It's the first lowest level of development of consciousness, because once you limit your consciousness to perception only of a physical, then you are not capable of understanding or even perceiving other things, right? So in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, when Jesus talks about this level of consciousness, he says, be vigilant. They will tell you that it is outside of you. It is there or it is here, but in fact, it is within you. So basically, that first level of process of moving up on the process of developing a consciousness of self-realization, Jesus says in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, is turning within. So look within. Don't be distracted by what's going on outside, right? People will tell you this is important, that is important, but what is important is your inner life. And it is really funny because I think nowadays I am really guilty of this because there is so much going on outside in the world. Some of them very puzzling or strange things. And I realized, for example, that I was giving attention to all kinds of stuff rather than focusing on, of my inner life. So this is actually the lowest level of consciousness in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Now, parallel concept in Jung, in the process of individuation, is the persona, which he says, which is the same. It's a wrong identification, he says. Persona, it is basically we as good citizens, which means we are enculturated from our birth, right? You have to be kind to elders. You have to be good at school. You have to do what you're told in your workplace and so on. You have to be successful. You have to have money. You have to have a profession. You have to get married. You have to have children. So basically, this is a social persona, Jung says. So persona is nothing wrong with it. We all have a social persona because, for example, at work, I cannot be often very completely authentic, and it's appropriate, and it's probably true about, for most people, unless they have our own business. So there's nothing wrong with having a social persona. But the danger, as also in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jesus says, that the danger is that we completely identify with that. So Jung says that the persona is just a sliver, a tiny part of who you really are. But through enculturation, we want to conform to societal expectations, what it means to be successful and so on. We totally 100% on this level of consciousness identify with our persona. So when it is taken away from us, for example, if you identify yourself as a husband and a father and you get divorced, or if you think you're a successful man and then you lose your job, this is when people collapse. And this is really sad, you would say, because this is just a small part who you are. This is just a public mask. In fact, persona is what in Greek theater was used as a mask for actors, right? So it's just a social mask. So as long as we remember that this is just a social mask, we can operate from this level, right? You can operate as a professor, for example, or a scholar, but that is not totally who you are. Or you can operate from a point of view of being podcaster on History Valley, right? But there is more to Jacob than that. Does it make sense?
Yes, I get what you're saying.
Yeah. So basically, it is a little bit like most people see me, as an academic, and you can think, okay, it's kind of boring for lots of people, but it is respectable, right? So when I went one day to a new hairdresser, he said, what do you do? And I said, oh, I give talks, I do research on this and that. And he says, no, but what you really do, right? So he was basically asking me about my persona, which in his head was, how do you make money? Right. So I said, oh, I'm academic. I coordinate all of these courses and I have, 600 students, postgraduate students under me. And then he was impressed. Right. So this is a persona. But both, according to Jung and according to the gospel teachings of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, this is the most basic level of consciousness. When we are completely obsessed with the material and we have no perception of anything else. And sometimes it doesn't matter, right? but it matters when some kind of crisis happens, and when you lose a job, as I said, or something happens to your relationship, if you identify with your relationship and suddenly people collapse, when this is just a small part of who we are. And this part actually really does not allow for any spirituality. It may allow for some rituals, right? Because, you may go to church or you may go to synagogue or something, but it's kind of more of a tradition about a true connection. So this would be the first level of consciousness according to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the first level of individuation for Jung, which is called the persona. Does it make sense?
Yep.
Would you like me to elaborate on something, or can we move to another level? Because there are 4 levels.
You can go ahead and elaborate and move on to the next level after that.
Okay, so this is okay. So also because Jung was interested in Egyptian esoterica, this is the level it is using. He was talking about Isis and Osiris and Horus. So he believed. So, for example, in this level of in Egyptian esoterica of wrong identification of persona, Isis is just the mother of Horus. So what happened there is, for example, when the Romans invaded Egypt, they stripped Isis as a goddess, as an archetype, from all of her magic, and secret powers, which she originally had in ancient Egypt, because they had to introduce her to the Roman senators, right? So like another possible deity. So she just became the mother, which later became like a Virgin Mary, right? Like the mother of a god, right? So this is just this kind of persona that she something was stripped away from her to make her acceptable to the Roman citizens, and this is what we do with our lives, right? So also, interestingly, in Egyptian esoterica, it is also called the Osiris' spine. Also has 4 levels of consciousness, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and like Carl Jung's process of individuation. So it's a first level when we are just completely identified with our social roles, and with a kind of scientific, hard scientific materialistic determinism. There's nothing else, right? That's just this body, right? And this material level. So the second level, it starts to be more interesting, especially in Jung, but I will start with the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So it is a craving or a desire. So Gospel of Mary Magdalene says you can drop it as a garment. So there are 2 ways. In each of these processes, there are 2 ways. You can either go up in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. You can either go up, which is evolve, or you can go down. So you can either give in to, for example, lower desire, or you can transcend it, or you can give in to the desire in a conscious way just to get over this, right? So that's why Jesus very controversially says in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, there is no sin. And what does he mean by that? He explains it there in the first part of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, when he says there is no sin, there are just consequences to our actions depending from which level of consciousness you did something, right? But we are in our actions in themselves are not sinful depending from which level of consciousness you use it, right? So if it is, so this is probably the most controversial line in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Now for Jung, the second level was the most, and also when we talk about the Egyptian esoterica, when we talk about Osiris' spine, it's called diet, which is basically the part of our being where our desires, unconscious desires, are being stored. And to deal with these desires, we basically have to bring them up into consciousness, right? So this is what the Gospel of Mary Magdalene says, and the Egyptian esoterica. And this is what Jung says. He was very much interested in the second level because he called it the shadow. And most people who are, Jungian psychoanalysts and so on, or just interested in Jung, they focus on shadow only. And it's a very important part, but this is only the second level of a process of individuation. So what is shadow according to Jung? So I'm going to quote his definition here. This is what we are trying to disown. So there is something, each of us has something that is like a secret desire, right? But we don't want to accept it about ourselves. So what we are trying to disown within our own psyche, we want to reject it. We desire this, but we want to reject it. And as much as we want to reject it, he says, it cannot be wished out of existence. So he basically says, as it says in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you can spend your lifetime trying to suppress something. But in fact, but this way you are never going to be whole. You're never going to achieve the level of self-realization, which is the fourth level. And this is, for example, an example here would be like a really suppressed or repressed saint, right? Who is always angry, right? Because he's denying himself something, right? Truly evolved saints, they're full of light, full of radiance, because they accepted what they are. So I recently saw this really nice saying, every sinner has a future, every saint has a past. So this is accepting, accepting this part of yourself that, is somehow you have a desire for, but you're rejecting it. So trying to disown with something that we try to disown within our own psyche, yet it will just not go away. It cannot be wished out of existence. So this is the part of you, and the part of any of us that we have, and we kind of have a kind of secret about ourselves, but we do not share it with society, right? We do not want to even accept it ourselves. I cannot accept it about myself because, it would like blemish me, right? Like as an academic or something, right? So I would never do this. So this is what people try to avoid. However, it is absolutely necessary for a psychological and even spiritual evolution. And Jung says it is the heroic endeavor that creates havoc. Because imagine something that you also yourself reject about yourself. It is a significant part of yourself. Something that you think other people that you value would not, and society at large, would not accept about you, and you decide to claim it, right? You kind of come out with whatever it is for you, right? You said, no, I am also that, right? So I'm also that. So the reason why it is really poignant when we talk about spiritual evolution, because I think that there's no point of studying the Bible, there's no point of studying the Gospel of Mary Magdalene if we just argue, who was first, who was second, and so on. It's a valuable historical work, but the primary reason for the existence of this text, all of this text from any tradition, is to provide us with spiritual guidance, right? So although scholarly rigor is really important in establishing certain things, it's also, we should not stop there. So because when spiritual awakening happens, and anyone who is serious about that spiritual evolution or had a spiritual awakening, and I'm sure some people, who are going to view this or already are viewing it, may went through some form of awakening, they can probably attest, as I can myself as well, that it does create havoc in our lives. Because suddenly, things that we considered really important, which is holding on to a persona or wrong identification, suddenly it takes a second seat, to our spiritual evolution, or just maybe not even spiritual, something that we're rejecting about ourselves and we are not willing to share with someone else. So it creates havoc, and it's unavoidable, and it is absolutely necessary for us to progress. Okay. So, for example, if my persona is an academic, So perhaps my my shadow, maybe it would be my I call myself spiritual detective also, or a spiritual seeker, because it is really not accepted, for example, where I am. It has to be from here to there, and you look at certain things only from according to Jung, persona, or Gospel of Mary Magdalene, wrong identification, right? Because it's a basic level of awareness. So if you're on a second level, you suddenly have this awakening, and other things are being important for you. And your friends and your family are telling you, you lost your marbles, why don't you just focus on your work and family, and, stop being interested in, I don't know, being a podcaster or being spiritual detective, or, I wrote the book, The Other Goddess, which is, from a point of view of people who I work, a wild thing. I'm talking about the goddesses of Eros and secret knowledge. And I share some personal experiences that were of spiritual nature for me, but they're also of erotic nature. So, that was my kind of accepting my shadow, right? And it did create havoc. And, it was a bit of an agony, because there is an inner struggle between persona and the shadow. So when we are talking about Egyptian esoterica, what was Isis's shadow? So I explained previously that in a persona, Isis was stripped from all her magical powers because she was really a goddess of magic and the resurrectrix of Osiris, to be accepted by, as a goddess, as an Egyptian goddess in the senatorial circles of Rome. Her persona, her shadow was Nephthys, which is basically the magical, kind of seductive part of Isis, which now in mythology was called her sister, her dark sister. So but this is a very good explanation, and that's why that Egyptians used, because of the shadow, or the second level of awareness in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because Nephthys was exactly what made Isis special. Without having the powers of magic, and access to the other worlds, she would not be able to resurrect Osiris and conceive Horus, right? So Jung's teaching is that not only we have to recognize our shadow, first you have to acknowledge there is something that you're rejecting about yourself. And for your own mental health, you should integrate it into your psyche. But also in your shadow lies your real gift. What you are afraid to show to the world, this is where your real gift lies, right? Which was later also repeated by Joseph Campbell, right? So what you're trying to hide from the world is actually your gift, your special gift. So this is deeply profound, and this is what I love about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I love about Jung, and I love about Egyptian esoterica. And that's why I'm using this example of Nephthys, which is like her dark side, Isis is dark side, because actually she's the powerful one. Without it, she's just like a wife of a senator, Isis. She's stripped of her magic. She's just a persona to be accepted by society. But Nephthys, once she's rejected, so once we reject a part of ourselves, and we don't want to look into this, it kind of degenerates, right? It sabotages us. So it is like an inner saboteur, right? You go for a job interview and you do really badly because you convince yourself that you really want this job, and it's a well-paid job and it will give you money and respect, but you really want to be a podcaster, or you really want to be a writer, or do you understand that it doesn't? Is it? Yeah, and that's why it creates havoc in our lives, because some people, especially that are important to us, once we decide to accept our shadow, they may not be able to deal with this because they just want a persona. That's why, for example, my mother lives in Poland. I lived in Australia, and I'm thinking about visiting my mother because I love her dearly. But all she wants is a persona from me. All she wants, is a successful daughter. So that's why I find it so emotionally exhausting to go to visit her, although I do want to visit her, because, you know, she basically forces upon me for her own benefit, you know, using only a sliver, as Jung says, of who I am, which is my persona, right? So that's why shadow is such a focus of Jungian psychoanalysis, and it is on a second level of individuation in Jung. So just let me check my notes. If I just yeah, I used it. Mm-hmm.
And before you go on, I'm going to take a couple of super chat questions real quick before you go on.
Please.
I Fish and Tie, thank you for your super chat. Is Mary Magdalene Mary of Bethany?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So, for example, Margaret Starbird argues, and also Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a medieval saint, and he also wrote the manifesto for Knights Templar, and he started the Crusades and so on. So, a very powerful person in medieval Europe, believed that Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany were the same, one and the same woman. And all kinds of esoteric sources, you know, later sources, so we just have to be aware of this, we're also claiming this. And in some of the sources, Mary Magdalene was also a daughter, not daughter, but a sister of Lazarus, and so on. So it depended who. So basically, yes, lots of including medieval saints, people believe that she's one and the same person, right? Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene. But Catholic tradition, in which I was originally brought up and eventually left, argues that they are two different people, right? So and also Margaret Starbird, I don't know if you read Margaret Starbird, she's arguing very strongly for Mary Magdalene as a Mary of Bethany as well.
Mr. Orlight, thank you for your super chat. Where is this lady from? I'm dying to know.
So
I think you already answered that question.
Brisbane, Australia now, but I'm originally from Poland, and I kind of moved globally because I lived in Sweden and Paris, and I'm also a Canadian citizen, and eventually I moved here. By here, I mean Australia.
JM, thank you for your super chat, and thank you for the thumbs up. Appreciate it. Great. All right, so continue where you left off when you were talking about the levels.
Okay,
earlier.
so we talk about the second level of individuation in Carl Jung, which is also the second level of consciousness from which we perceive things to evolve spiritually, or to evolve as a healthy, mentally healthy people, according to Jung, right? And I was using some examples of from Egyptian esoterica because Jung himself was very interested in it, and he was using the examples of Isis and Osiris and Horus and so on. So then the importance of shadow and integrating the shadow and remembering, and I think this is very important for people who have courage to do this, is that not only is good for your mental health, but that, you know, you have the courage, you have to have the courage to face it, because some people will reject it even if you accept it. That it will be new, fuller you, but some people may not want it, right? Some people say, oh, I like you, you know, like being just a husband or being just a wife or just being a professional person, successful person. So this is where spiritual awakening starts. Basically, spiritual awakening starts when we recognize our shadow, and this is a different part for everybody else. And we then courageously integrate it to the rest of our personality and show it to the world. You know, I suggest if you show it to the world, show it gradually, because some people go for a general freak out, right? If you come out too quickly. But when I run workshops, for example, in Carl Jung societies, when I ask the audience, you know, what do you think is your shadow? You know, so one woman said, oh, a good girl. You know, I was always playing a good girl, but then it was kind of, you know, degenerated to me kind of secretly being a seductress and getting into wrong relationships and so on. And one psychologist said that, you know, I had other examples that he really wanted to be the guy with a nice car, you know, and so on. So these are the shadows, right? We all have shadows, and we have to acknowledge them and integrate them. But what is beautiful about it, it is that once we integrate them, and this is what Gospel of Mary Magdalene says, sometimes, you know, they just go away. Sometimes they just become part of you, but sometimes they go away because all they needed is to be acknowledged. You know, depends, you know, what's going on in your psyche. So this is the most important part in this process. Then the third level is in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is ignorance versus higher wisdom. And it's quite interesting because in this choice between ignorance and a higher wisdom is actually again represented very beautifully in the Egyptian esoterica, by that time in ancient Egypt, and then first century to about 3rd century Egypt, because it is represented by Sekhem. Now Sekhem was Latinized later as scepter, and in English it's scepter. And it's Sekhem or scepter has two ends and two possible choices, because each level at the Gospel of Mary Magdalene can go up or you can go down. So one, it is now you have spiritual insight. Now you actually have access to your magical powers. Okay, the where, for example, Isis had once she reconciled with her dark side, you know, or her shadow Nephthys. And how are you going to use this higher wisdom? Because it has two ends. Sekhem or scepter has two ends. One is the power to evolve spiritually, which is a higher choice. And the second one is the power to manipulate others, which I think is very interesting, because I hope I'm not getting too conspiratorial here, but I sometimes think that very powerful people get, you know, because that's why they get so much attention and they are so successful, you know, they do have an insight, you know, so they actually integrated the shadow, right? So this is like now the third level, according to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, is you now gain a spiritual insight. Now, just because you have a spiritual insight doesn't mean that you are going to use it for the good, because actually now you're much more powerful than people on level 1 and level 2. So there is a huge temptation there. There is a huge temptation there to use it to manipulate others, right? For example, power, money, success, right? But the higher choice, according to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, is to evolve spiritually, focus on your spiritual evolution, because we are not at the end of the process of individuation yet. So, for example, in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it is called nous. Now, nous is an interesting concept, and has I don't want to digress too much, but also has a equivalent in Hindu esoterica as well, not only in Egyptian esoterica. It means that nous is this power of human psyche, or this part of human psyche, which connects the soul with eternity, or with God's consciousness, or Christ consciousness, you know, or divine consciousness, whatever you want to call it, depending on your religious beliefs, right? With the universal consciousness. So nous is the space, it's also called the liminal space, where you suddenly, your vision expands, your field of perception expands, you know, so you're not only bound by this materialistic kind of determinism, then, you know, you're just this body and this is what the science says, but you actually have a spiritual insight. So it's called nous. And it's quite interesting because in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, in the second part, you remember I told you that there are two parts to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene because a few pages are missing. So in the second part, Mary Magdalene tells the disciples that Jesus, she saw Jesus in a vision in the liminal space. So not in a material space. And there is there is so obviously it's different from the Bible because she saw him in a liminal space, and it creates havoc among disciples, other disciples, because they say, like, how come she sees him and we don't see her? Right? Like maybe she imagined it, but no, she didn't imagine it, because Jesus tells her, you're blessed as my sight does not disturb you. And where is a noose, there is a treasure. You can see me through the noose. It means you develop now the psychic power to see me beyond the material. And this is actually in the liminal space, the immaterial, that he gives her teachings that of his 4 levels of consciousness, that teachings that human beings need to evolve. So in Jung struggled a little bit with this, because he came up with the concept of anima, which now in Jungian psychology is mostly used as the feminine as versus masculine animus and anima. But also he said that anima basically means the soul, which is like nous, which gives us perception into liminal spaces, right? So if you don't mind, I'll just digress for a moment, because in my next book, which is just now in progress, I started to write about the liminal spaces, exactly, how people perceive things. And the reason why I actually started to be interested in is through work of Diana Pasuka and so on, and she wrote American Cosmic and the Encounters, because very often if there is some anomalous experience, some people see it, and there's a group of people and some people see it and some people don't see it. And it is basically depending on from which level of consciousness, according to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and Jung, we perceive things. Do we give ourselves a permission to perceive, from another realm, so to speak? But to perceive from another realm, first we have to acknowledge and integrate our shadow. And then we are in the nous, or in anima, according to depending whether we talk about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or Jung. So, so for example, in this version, we talk about esoterica. It is where Mary Magdalene Isis and Nephthys, become the hierophant, because in Egyptian esoterica, Isis is actually giving us the experience of the immaterial, right? And life after death, right? And Mary Magdalene, in my opinion, reconciles, the beautiful woman, that was desired, and the woman that also was the one to which Jesus gave advanced esoteric teachings. Right? So now we are integrated, and now we have that insight, spiritual insight, which in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is called nous. And one of the definitions of anima in Jung is also the soul, although it's now mostly used as the feminine part of our personality by psychologists. And now in Egyptian esoterica, it's also referred to sekem, which means now you have to choose when you have this insight, which comes with powers, which in ancient Egypt would be called magical powers or spiritual powers, or some deeper insight, when it allows people to maybe manipulate reality to their advantage. And now you can do it to manipulate reality to your advantage for success, money, whatever. Or you can choose to evolve higher, and then you go to the 4th level of ascension or spiritual insight. So the 4th level is called the wrath of the ego, basically the wrath in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And in Jung, it is called, at the end, when it is accomplished, individuation. Because what happens there? It is like the last scream of your persona. When you think you got it, because let's say you chose spiritual evolution or spiritual insight over manipulation of reality. And the Gospel of Mary Magdalene talks about it at the end as well. So please don't let me forget it, because it talks about manipulation of reality. At the very end, there's a very enigmatic line. And this is when, according to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, your persona screams, "Who do you think you are?" And basically, I'm quoting now from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. "Where do you come from, murderer?" Because you're murdering your persona, right? "And where are you going, vagabond? You're nobody. So you think you evolved, eh? And who are you? What do you have? So suddenly, this is when you think like you got there, you have a spiritual insight, and suddenly, your own psyche or even people around you, which basically only mirror this, attacked you. Okay, so now you don't have a car, you don't have a house, who do you think you are? So so now you're spiritual, right? Okay. So once and there are like 7 levels to this, which I'm still planning to explore in my next book, but they are similar to the 7 deadly sins in Catholicism, which basically this is the last scream of a persona, of this kind of materialistic level consciousness that's telling you this is all there is. There's not much more to this, And just as you think that you are ready to merge with Christ consciousness, let's say through spiritual experience or so on, this kind of voices of self-doubt attack you. Yeah. And it is quite interesting because in the Egyptian esoterica, this is what Ankh represents. So Ankh represents, overcoming this voice of a persona, and merging of realities, right? As a cross and over serpent on top of this, merging of these realities together. And this is what Jung calls individuation. So I'll just read his other definition: the process by which a person a psychological individuation recognizes his own innermost uniqueness. And basically, it is somewhere between Christ consciousness or universal consciousness and complete self-acceptance. So that you cannot arrive there until you combat the self-doubts, at the very end. So first self-acceptance, and then, Christ consciousness. And in Neoplatonism, by the way, there are similar levels, and Jean-Luc Leloup discusses it in his book, and it's called pneuma or pneuma, which is like the divine consciousness. And in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jesus say, these are words of Jesus. And this is what sometimes, it is said in church, but people do not understand. Even when I was going to church, I didn't understand. May my peace arise and be fulfilled within you. This is so touching. Wow. If you actually understand it, right? It's not peace be with you. And kind of everybody goes back to their car in the church, right? May my peace arise within you and be fulfilled within you. So basically, and this is what happens in all esoteric traditions, which was unfortunately, I believe, lost in Christianity, but it's still carried on in some esoteric Hinduism, and also was carried on in Egyptian esoterica, is the transmission of energy, or in Christianity is called grace, right? So you transmit a highly evolved teacher, and the Gnostics talk about Jesus as the teacher, transmits his own energy to you. So you can have experience of that other reality. And this is what true spiritual awakening is. We have this experience of this deeper reality. We are not caught in this three-dimensional reality anymore. And may it be fulfilled within you. So maybe it grow within you. So you can be the divine being that you were meant to be, basically, right? So when you go for a spiritual awakening, I had a, initiation, and I went for spiritual awakening, and I was given this peace, but unfortunately I couldn't hold it, So, but now, having this experience many years ago, I know what is possible. And now I'm through my contact with the sacred texts, including the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, momentarily I can recapture this moment. But great beings of any traditions, including Jesus, they were different from us in this sense that they could hold it at all times, right? So it's not like a glimpse of this or a glimpse of that. So it is, I just want to repeat these words again. May my peace arise you and be fulfilled within you. And then Mary Magdalene, when she quotes Jesus, says, he is calling upon us to become fully anthropos with A, and of course, capital A. And of course, people interpret it in so many ways, right? But anthropos, in kind of the way I understand it, is the fulfilled human being, but the human being who fulfilled his or her potential, right? The way Jesus did, or the Buddha or anybody. So now I mentioned that there are these last lines of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene that are very enigmatic, and they actually talk about manipulation of reality, which is again very Egyptian in nature, because in Egyptian esoterica, this is what Isis actually says. So it's quite interesting in itself. So these are, according to Mary Magdalene, the last words. I left the world with the aid of another world. So basically, it's almost like the consciousness descends upon you, like as grace. A design was erased by a virtue of a higher design. So I think it's really enigmatic. So I left the world with the aid of another world. Okay. So there's some aid from high above, or highest form of consciousness, which is Numa. And a design, which means our reality, was erased by a virtue of a higher design. So basically, for me, the message is, it's not about who was first, which gospel and so on, but to focus on the teachings, okay? So a design was erased by a virtue of higher design. Once we work on ourselves, which are the first words, right? Look within, it's not here, it's not there, as they tell you, look within. Assimilate or integrate, what you think you should be rejecting about yourself is actually an integral part of yourself. You gain a spiritual insight, and then choose to use it for good and not to control others. And then the design of whole reality in which we live, it's my English, in which we live is going to be changed, right? Because there is a higher design that is going to almost like descend upon us. And this is interestingly what when you study, as I did, Egyptian esoterica, this is what basically it's called higher magic of Isis, because there's a lower magic which you just manipulate things like with Sekhem for your own benefit, right? And there's a higher magic of Isis when she basically, kind of modern terminology, you can ask for help to rearrange the matrix, so to speak. So what is not perfect, or what was corrupted since the moment of creation, now can be corrected. So it's high magic of Isis, and which really reminds me of his last words of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I left the world with the aid of another world. A design was erased by a virtue of a higher design, right? So it's like through the spiritual insight and the higher choices, because on each level of Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you have a higher and a lower choice. We actually change the design of our reality, which I think is very optimistic. And Jung says that this is the end of the process of individuation, which was always spiritual in nature. That's why he had to break up with Freud, who didn't believe in spirituality that much or at all. And it is equated with self-realization. And self-realization is basically this, right? You can stay in the state of higher level of consciousness at all times. So I hope it wasn't too much. And I think this is what I would have to say about Jung and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. They both have 4 levels of evolution of human consciousness, and they give different names to it. And Jung also referred to the Egyptian esoterica, and I think in some wording of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, this Egyptian esoterica is also present, and that's why I was talking about it. The same kind of levels of consciousness are also discussed in the Hindu esoterica, so it's quite interesting, that all of these traditions have it, and that's the sole reason for reading sacred texts, communing, so to speak, with sacred texts, so we can evolve spiritually. I think this is it, unless there are some questions. So please let me know, Jacob.
We do have a super chat. Esmil, thank you for your super chat. What is the Cosmic Encounters book she mentioned?
Oh, the Cosmic Encounters book is written by a professor of religious studies, Diana Pasuka, which I highly recommend. And she is talking about basically how, from a perspective of religious studies, she's talking about the concept of UFOs, how it is turning into a form of religion. And she's actually studying how some people call angels, some people call UFOs, right? So she gives, for example, there's one example when in somebody's lunchroom, there is a couple. She's Catholic and he's, her husband, doesn't believe in God. And she was praying for something to heal someone. And suddenly they see like 2 lights in the room. And she says, these are angels. And he says, no, these are like metallic orbs. Right? So they saw completely different things because from a different level of consciousness, right? So she's looking into this. And her second book is about encounters with non-human intelligences. And what is interesting about it is that she's actually quoting scientists from NASA. She's close with them, so she's not only talking about religious kind of perspective, but she's also looking at people who work for NASA and who have like downloads, amazing downloads, technological downloads that they get from somewhere, right? But through meditation and so on. And then they work for NASA. Right, so she says there is something going on there. 2 fantastic books that I highly recommend.
Dalai Lama, thank you for becoming a member of the channel. Appreciate it. Okay, so let's talk about your course with the Sacred You website, sacredstories.com. Let me.
I forgot all about it. I got carried away. Okay, so just as you search for it, I very briefly discuss
Here it is.
Because I wrote this course. My publisher asked me to write this course after she published my book, The Other Goddess. So just in terms of transparency, I want to say that The Other Goddess is talking about goddesses of eros and secret knowledge. So basically, I'm not talking about Jung there, but I'm talking about Mary Magdalene as belonging to esoteric lineage, basically, of esoteric teachings. So, this course was probably mostly intended for women because of a website, but I think that if you want to understand how it all works, it's probably good for everyone. So maybe let's go to module 1. So this is basically 8-hour course, which is pre-recorded. Each module has a 1-hour lecture by me with PowerPoints with beautiful images. It has journaling questions for self-reflection, and it has a guided meditation. Okay, this is really small for me. I think I'm stretching my eyesight. Okay, so the first one is actually starting with relationships, and looking at the common problems of relationships, and I'm discussing from an esoteric point of view the difference between sexual impulse, sexual alchemy, and erotic connection. So I explain what they are, and also, so basically, sexual impulse is, everybody knows what it is, right? You just feel really desiring of someone or something. And then erotic connection, when people give me examples, an erotic connection, it is when people actually may have a very deep spiritual awakening during an erotic encounter. And I discuss it. What does it mean in esoteric traditions? And then there's an sexual alchemy, which is basically then there are traditions around it that try to ritualize it, so this experience can be repeated. Now, second, and I discussed also about in history about high priestesses and so on, and goddesses such as Inanna or Ishtar, who are actually in charge of this. The second module is talking about spirituality and Tantra, because for about a year and a half, I studied tantric text, Kula ritual, especially chapter 29, I believe it is, with the translator of his work, who is a Sanskrit scholar, and believe it or not, he's actually also a Catholic priest. And with him and with a Swami, Hindu Swami, and a Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist monk, we studied the text. Okay, so we studied the teachings of the text, which is extremely encoded and difficult, but we had the benefit of a person who translated it. So I'm kind of explaining and simplifying, what was done during the Kula ritual, which actually was raising, erotic energy and allowing people to reach higher states of consciousness. So this is what real Tantra is. It's not what, it's taught in California. It's not about improving people's sexual life. It is about reaching higher states of consciousness. And then I also paraphrase the tantric prayer, which is at the end, which is, also very helpful. It's a beautiful, I think Tantra is really misunderstood. Then Eros in magic, this module, it's module 3. So I talk about esoteric Egyptian traditions and what they were saying about, the same thing. It's basically like Egyptian Tantra, reaching higher states of consciousness through erotic connection and erotic alchemy. And I give examples, because they are historical examples. People are often familiar even with them, because we know about Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and they had the esoteric also erotic connection, what rituals they did. And before them, there was this women pharaoh Hatshepsut, and she was actually, there are claims that she was actually communing with the higher powers, through erotic connection and so on. So I'll discuss the Egyptian esoterica from erotic point of view in module 3. Now, can you move to module 4? So module 4, so I can see. Okay, so now here I discuss, Mary Magdalene and some esoteric texts when we talk about Mary Magdalene and as a partner of Jesus. She was in the Gospel of Philip, she's called the koinonos, which means basically the partner of Jesus. She was not even called the wife of Jesus, but the partner of Jesus, which is quite interesting. And this is the Gospel also that talks about Jesus kissing Mary. It's often translated kissed Mary on the lips, but it's not. The part where he kissed her is actually torn away from the from the papyrus, so we don't know where he kissed her. And this as a kind of sacred sexuality, the connection between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, it can be controversial for some people. Then I discuss Gnostic goddess Sophia and her connection with Jesus. So there's a story of Sophia. And that Mary Magdalene, in some Gnostic circles, was considered the personification of goddess Sophia. And then I discuss another Gnostic couple, which is Simon Magus and Helena. So Simon Magus was the Simon the magician for people who read the Bible, and he was presented in a very negative way there. But some Gnostics believe that he was like the shadow of Jesus, and so Helena was like a shadow in Jungian terms of Mary Magdalene. And my friend from Ion Bay Gnostic Radio, Miguel, always said that if Jesus and Mary Magdalene are like the Beatles, then Simon and Helena are like the Rolling Stones. So it's basically the esoteric version of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And module 5, reclaiming the goddesses of Eros and secret knowledge. Oh, I'm talking about Kali. Okay, I'm talking about, again, returning back to Hinduism and bringing it back to Mary Magdalene, because there are many similarities, including visual similarities, in esoteric tantra between goddess Kali, Mary Magdalene, and goddess Sundari, and her exercises, meditations, and so on. So it is not really Jung related to our talk, but this is a course that I created 2 years ago for people who want to take it, and how the secret knowledge, and I'm basically saying that how the secret knowledge of attaining higher levels of consciousness through eros was actually suppressed and survived in some esoteric traditions of Egypt and Hinduism, and also in some forms of Gnosticism. I forgot the 2 Gnostic groups at the moment, but they actually were talking about it as well. And I'm saying that basically, why even create a course like that? Because I think that eros is what Jung says, the ultimate shadow. That it is something that we cannot wish out of existence and ascetic try, but we are asked to integrate it, but we can try to integrate it from a highest possible note. So if we can imagine the symphony of our life or symphony of our being, take it from a highest note, approach from a highest level of consciousness, it can also expand our consciousness, and there are rituals associated with it and so on, which are not my rituals, which, as came through the study of the sources, and I just try to simplify them because the esoteric texts are, very difficult to understand. So this is the course, Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge, basically evolution of consciousness through erotic means.
And I have the affiliate link to purchase the course in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment as well. And it's also pinned in the live chat as well, if you want to go purchase the course. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Joanna Kujawa.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to see you, and I'm glad that some people were in the chat. It was beautiful to connect with everyone. Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for joining me. And one more thing I'll remind everybody is that her book on the goddess Eros is also in the description as well, if you want to go buy that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.